My name is Trevor Parkhill. I'm the president of the Ulster Society of Irish Historical Studies, and I'm very glad to welcome you to this, the second in our series 2022-23 series of lectures. This lecture is being given by Dr Christina Brophy of Triton College. The title is, "Oh Jammie, what have you done? Traumatic Assaults on Women and Imaginative Resistance in Mid-20th Century Irish Folklore." A most intriguing title, and it's my pleasure to hand over to Christina. But before that, maybe Lindsay would want to provide us with some house rules.
Yes, so everybody is on mute and you'll not be able to unmute yourself throughout the presentation. That's just to minimize any background noise. If you do have any questions for Christina along the way, if you can put them into the chat, we'll make sure they get asked at the end. And this presentation is also being recorded, so just to make you aware that it's being recorded, if you have your cameras on. We do record it in speaker view, but just to be sure that if you make sure that you turn your camera off if you don't want to appear on the screen at any point in time. So thank you, Trevor, for introducing that, and I'm going to hand over now to Christina for her presentation.
All right, well, first I have to say I'm so excited to be here today and grateful for the invitation to present some of my work to you. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus on items that I think are more engaging of my recent folklore research. Please feel encouraged to ask questions. I have a lot more that I'd like to tell you about that I can't include today, and my work will be much improved by your queries. All right, so let's dig in. Until fairly recently, late 19th and 20th century Irish women were portrayed in art, literature, and even history as largely demoralized, passive, and poor. Women in the post-famine period faced many challenges. Shifts in agriculture, as well as a confluence of political and religious ideologies and policies, led to declining access to wages, fewer choices, and greater domestic confinement. In fact, these changes are part of what encouraged the extraordinary immigration of single Irish women in the 19th and 20th centuries. Due both to economics and ideology, circumstances for women did not improve with the achievement of Irish independence from Britain in 1922. As in other emerging republics, Irish politicians and religious leaders attempted to both demonstrate their distinct ethnic character and ameliorate indignities suffered by men under previous domination by lowering women's status and exerting greater control over women's bodies. Despite tremendous adversity, post-famine Irish women found ways to negotiate, flout, and occasionally reject oppressive strictures. I'm a historian who employs intersectional feminist analysis and folklore primary source materials to examine non-elite Irish women's resistance to patriarchal oppression in the 19th and 20th centuries. Most archives that historians used were not designed to preserve evidence of marginalized groups, much less their resistance to repressive regimes. In contrast, the National Folklore Collection, successor to the Irish Folklore Commission, is a rich archive that contains some of the most democratic source material available. And as such, it's a fantastic resource for the study of popular culture and history. However, like all sources, the folklore records held in Dublin are skewed in several ways. As Diarmuid O'Geelan has written, sponsored by the fledgling Irish government, the Irish Folklore Commission was deeply influenced by Romantic nationalism. Irish nationalist politicians charged the commission with the task of saving the remnants of Irish culture after what they viewed as an extended onslaught by English colonizers. Collectors located that which they perceived to be essentially Irish in areas and people most removed from English influences. For the most part, in poorer rural communities of the West, South and Northwest. Collectors focused their efforts on Gaeltacht areas and, finding the greatest authenticity in past practices, sought elderly informants. Gender also played a role in the selection of both collectors and informants. As Fionnuala na Suibhne has noted, of the full-time collectors hired in 1935, all were men. In fact, no woman was ever employed as a full-time collector. By 1940, approximately 150 part-time collectors were paid to cover their expenses. About 12.5% of part-time collectors were female, and only 15% of the approximately 40,000 informants were female. Despite this, the Irish Folklore Archive yields large quantities of accounts from historically marginalized individuals and communities. Deeply analyzed folklore materials, contextualized with historical sources, reveal how individuals and communities use their traditions to digest, interpret, and at times diverge from hegemonic regimes. Analysis of folklore materials yields contributors' values and mindsets, as well as articulations of power dynamics and instances of protest. The employment of folklore sources expands and enriches cultural and social historical studies. Now, I'm developing a concept that I've dubbed imaginative resistance to discuss the subversive use of cultural means by marginalized individuals and groups to creatively reframe and/or reject their oppressive circumstances. I created the term to indicate the movement of resistance to the imaginative realm in contexts where explicit outward expression was costly. I've argued that the functions of some folk narratives were to first create a space to resist, to imagine different outcomes, specifically outcomes that would be more favorable to the victim of injustice, to avenge indignities suffered by oppressed individuals or groups, to indicate righteousness by referring to miraculous intervention and/or supernatural sanction, to point to a history of resistance and resilience, to offer oppressed individuals and groups hope, and finally, to communicate this counter discourse to a community over generations. Employing folklore sources, I've located the resistance of 19th and 20th century Irish women in the verse and behavior of Nakincha, that's semi-professional keening women, in narratives about fairies and the banshee, and in lore about luck, fishing, and red hair. In this presentation, I'll turn my focus to folklore collected in the 1930s and 1940s, specifically anecdotes relating to land lore, the attempted rape of St. Brigid, vulnerable sea creatures, and marital violence. I will analyze lore in the hopes of revealing how individuals and communities process trauma and protested both violence against women and the inferior status women occupied in the early and mid-20th century in both Ireland and briefly Northern Ireland. In their joint interdisciplinary work, Rosemary Byrne, Stephanie McCurry, and Jane Ohlmeyer have noted the reticence of women to speak about traumatic attacks, especially rapes, in both historical sources and legal testimony. More often, women employ vague euphemisms and refer only indirectly to violence against them by relating lesser intimate violations and humiliations that occurred in connection to their assaults, such as being stripped of clothing or of aggressors cutting their hair. There are many reasons that victims of rape and of marital violence have chosen not to discuss their assaults. Costly stigmas accompany female claims of assault in patriarchal societies, where victims are frequently portrayed as culpable for the violence that they've endured. Women who openly assert they've been attacked are routinely re-traumatized in police stations and courtrooms through media attention, by whispering neighbors, and through both communal and familial alienation. Given the consequences of publicly relating instances of intimate assault, and at the same time the need for individuals and communities to process experiences of violence and victimization, it's not surprising to discover indirect and allegorical anecdotes in folklore. These tales likely gave an opportunity to discuss trauma in a distant way that would not draw attention to individuals. Okay, so now I'm going to dig into land lore. Tales of creative human interactions with the land of Ireland predate literacy, and are reflected in the Dín Shanahas. 20th century folklore informants also related lore about places, but rather than designate names, they remembered assorted events and interactions, and the impressions that these made on each location. Given the bent of Irish folklore collectors, as well as the historical context of informants, it's not surprising that many of the accounts reflect collective thinking about sectarian violence and humiliations of colonial history. Now, my interest in the land lore I'm going to relate is not to discuss the truth of the accounts, but rather what these accounts tell us about the historical communities that maintained and related these stories. So the first narrative I'm going to share was collected in 1944 from an unnamed Donegal man. Quote, "The last monk of Osero Abbey was Father Philip O'Clery, who was hiding on an island in Carricknahorna Lake. On answering a bogus sick call, he was put up against the gable end of a non-Catholic's house and shot dead. Where he fell, no grass again grew, And to obliterate the memory of the crime, the ancestors who were cursed to the 7th generation built a shed on the spot. The family responsible was called Cromwell. It wasn't really Cromwell, but I didn't want to upset the family, so I'm using a pseudonym. This happened in 1643. It appears that this tale was intended to remember not only a priest's murder, but also to relate persistent sectarian tensions and to pick a side in the ongoing conflicts. In folk logic, the environment's continuing miraculous recognition of the terrible crime, as well as the guilty family's desire to conceal it down the generations, testify to Father O'Clery's innocence and to the land siding with him. Though a shed covered the spot where he fell, the memory of resistance to this injustice remained and was held within the land in this communal lore. All right, next up, I have an account collected in County Louth in 1934, describing a miraculous mass rock. Quote, at a turn in the road, about 100 yards due east of Whitestown Cross, a by-road runs east to certain lands in the townland of Ballaghan. In one of these fences, there's a stone with a cross on it. Tradition has it that in penal days, this stone served as an altar stone on which Mass was celebrated. Old people remember the time in their youth when the custom was fairly general for people of the immediate district to go on Sundays and pray beside the stone. It's remarked that moss never grows on this particular stone. So this tale preserves the memory of a community's resistance to penal oppression and the persistence of their faith. But it does more than that. By claiming that moss never grows in the mass rock, the communal lore asserts a righteousness to the Catholic community, so overwhelming that it imbued the stone with a miraculous character. As the Donegal tale previously, where the grass stopped growing, in this narrative, the land reflects and preserves the tense history of the area, testifying to past holiness. While the penal era concluded long ago, the stone in the community it represents remain and continue to bear witness to a history of resistance. The moss-resistant rock reveals that Catholic identity was of utmost importance to this post-colonial community and how they defined their distinction from past oppressors. The next tale was recorded in 1934 for the Monksland School in County Louth by the teacher G. Lowe. It reports a tradition about a local well dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Quote, a rather remarkable story has been told by the owner, to me by the owner of the surrounding lands, Mr. Daniel Finnegan. He said that when he was a child, his father hired a servant girl in the hiring fair at Dundalk, who was a complete stranger to the district. On her first morning in Finnegan's house, she was told to go to the well for water, which well was convenient to Ladywell. However, sorry about that. I lost my place. However, the girl mistook the ordinary well for Ladywell and took a cawful of Ladywell water. When she arrived home, she filled the kettle with the water from the can and placed the kettle on the fire. The water, after being on the fire for a considerable time, was found to be still quite cold. She put more coals on the fire, and after some time, the water was found to be as cold as ever. In the end, she discovered that she could not get the water to boil. She told the people of the house, who asked her to point out to them where she got the water. Mrs. Finnegan, Daniel's mother, went out with her to learn that it was that it was water from Ladywell she brought in, and further that Ladywell water will not boil, nor can it be heated. Unquote. In this tale, we find holy well water that maintains its sacred character by being miraculously immune to heat. Like the grass-resistant bit of earth and the moss-averse mass rock, Ladywell water was silent and non-threatening, and largely goes unnoticed, but it resists molestation and maintains its sacred character. The water appears to be vaguely imbued with the identity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, whose devotional objects in Irish folklore, specifically scapulars and death habits, are known to be resistant to fire and hellfire, and to protect wearers from both. The water, like the faithful woman it represents, initially seems powerless to resist insult, but further interaction reveals supernatural resilience. Located in a contested area of Ireland, the resistance of the water is analogous to that of the Catholic population's resistance to the vagaries of British rule. Related over a decade after the conclusion of the War for Irish Independence and the Civil War that followed, the maintenance of this tale in communal traditions reveals that the community continued to process its oppressive past, where open rebelliousness was dangerous and most chose silent resistance. These narratives portray vulnerable, harassed, but defiant and persevering communities. Within these tales, we have the idea of inviolate holiness. On the one hand, these objects are powerless. They lack speech and agency. On the other hand, through their miraculous characters, they bear witness to an enduring land and community that records trauma and preserves resistance. Dating from the early Irish Free State, these quasi-religious tales testify to the endurance and ultimate triumph of the Catholic community over British oppression. They also say something about gender. In the broader context of Irish mythology, elite and popular ashling poetry, Ireland, its land and community, has been conceived of as feminine and personified by assorted sovereignty goddesses. These allegorical females have been understood to manifest through their appearance and behavior the justice or injustice of contemporary rule and resulting effects on land and people. Thus, I'm arguing that the objects of lore examined so far personified a vulnerable, feminized Irish population, quietly recording and resisting molestation. Exploration of St. Brigid land lore tales will underscore the role of gender and imaginative resistance in this lore. All right, so we're switching gears to St. Brigid now. Now, while in her hagiography, St. Brigid was portrayed as triumphant and fearless, 20th century folklore narratives depict her showing vulnerability common to impoverished women. I will argue that anecdotes, which purportedly relate to the circumstance of St. Brigid's attempted rape in the 5th century, these are from, again, from the 1930s and 40s, in part functioned as a way for some to safely process instances of sexual assault. In women's narratives, St. Brigid was not shamed for her would-be rapist's intentions or actions. Instead, she was celebrated as righteous and heroic. These narratives reveal critiques of male entitlement to women's sexuality, elision of male guilt in sexual assault, and female marginalization in Irish society. Like the previously examined materials, landlore tales of St. Brigid fleeing a would-be rapist from 1942 reveal a malleable interactive environment made wholly by Brigid's preservation. St. Brigid landlore also exposes conflicting views of the role of women as well as gendered resistance. While male and female informants related tales with similar plot points, male tellers of this tale tended to be rather matter-of-fact about the circumstances and sometimes elided the guilt of Brigid's attacker, while female storytellers generally related Brigid's terrifying experience, the brutality of her fully culpable attacker, and Brigid's empowering legacy. In all instances, the action occurred in or by a stream in Foggart, County Armagh, where both Brigid and her attacker left their imprints. The first example I'm going to share with you is from 1942. Mrs. Mary Murphy of Newry, County Down, recorded the following tale that was told to her by her mother, Mrs. A. McCoy of Mullabon, County Armagh. Quote, "Once a king insisted on St. Brigid accepting his proposal of marriage. She was so horrified that she fled from his presence and had recourse to prayer. She fell on her knees on a stone by the stream at Foggart. She prayed to God for help. She put up her hand and pulled out her eye and flung it away. The imprint of her knees is to be seen in the stone, and a mark in another stone is pointed out as being the place where her eye fell. The king followed her in hot pursuit, and a cutting in another stone is said to be the impression of the horse's hooves. Her whole appearance was so changed that she actually met the king, and he failed to recognize her," unquote. In this telling, Brigid's courageous, shocking act, defying the insistent king, transformed her. Not merely the missing eye, but all of her was changed by her acts of faith and valor. In fact, in this lore, even the environment was affected. The intended rape and Brigid's resistance was so traumatic and momentous that they left marks on the very stones. Brigid's impressions, her knee prints and flung eye, left mnemonic evidence, according to the tale, of her incredible vulnerability and desperate resort to prayer and self-destruction. The king's marks were made by his horse's hooves, demonstrating the physical and socioeconomic advantages he held over her. Despite her seeming weaknesses, the triumph was Brigid's. In this tale, similar to Lady Wellwater and the Mass Rock, inviolate female holiness persevered and resisted despoilment. Just for a second, I wanted to show you, this is Michael J. Murphy. He was a folklore collector known for his expert, meticulous recording of informants' Hiberno-English pronunciation and idiosyncrasies. Here you can see him pictured with his wife and sons in a 1947 photo. He provided, or he collected the next few accounts that I'm going to share. This account was, this tale about St. Bridget comes from Frank Woods, who was aged between 90 and 100 years at the time, a farmer and a native of Foggart. So, and I'm not going to attempt to do Frank's accent because I don't think that would be right. So St. Bridget was a very good-looking lassie, and she was all the time praying. She went away to release her mother, who was a slave. She was a king's daughter. She was followed home by a man on horseback. And when she got to the stream, she couldn't run from him no further, and went down on her knees in the water and tore the eye from her head. The stone where it lit is to be seen, and the track of the lash of the man's whip is in the stone as well. And when the man saw her, and her after disfiguring herself, he didn't know her at all, and left her to herself. She brought a blessing on Foggart ever since. I've heard it's the best grazing in all Ireland, and lightning never does no harm here, though many a harm was done by it away from here. And when the troubles times was in it, there were hundreds of mines on Foggart Hill to fight the Black and Tans, but the things they had in the road didn't go off, and Foggart was saved from being destroyed. In Mr. Wood's version, Bridget's attractive physical appearance merits mention. Perhaps this is a way to subtly reduce the culpability of the attacker and to lay some of the responsibility on Brigid for the man's attention and aggression. The notion that the only protection for sexually desirable girls and women was to hide them away rather than punishing men or finding men culpable for sexual assault was reflected in the fledgling Irish Free State policies of containment of women to prevent or limit sexual sin and deviance. Perhaps the reason the lascivious man left a disfigured Brigid alone is because he wanted a submissive girl, not an assertive woman willing to sacrifice what men prized most about her, her physical desirability. Perhaps, no longer seeing what he wanted in Brigid, he left her alone. Regardless, saved from rape, Brigid blessed Foggart with agricultural fertility and preservation from fire, be the source lightning or sectarian bombs. Convenient. While these blessings are consistent with her larger role, they're also hugely appealing to a Republican farming community. The next excerpt was collected by Michael J. Murphy about St. Bridget from Tom Dunn, a 69-year-old farmer, also in County Armagh. You know, she was followed from Kildare by a man that wanted to marry her. On the way, she worked a lot of miracles, and one in particular made a lord ask her to name any favor she might mention. So she asked that her mother might be released from being a slave. Her husband sold her as a slave, it seems, unquote. It's interesting to note that Mr. Dunn reported the Kildare man who pursued Brigid wanted to marry her. It might be in this context a polite euphemism for rape. Brigid's father had sold Brigid's mother when Brigid was just a child and left Brigid in bondage until she came of age. Given the circumstances, it's safe to say that Brigid's mother was impregnated against her will and likely faced the possibility of rape for the entirety of her servitude. While the casual mention of Brigid's mother's enslavement might be a quick retelling of Brigid's hagiography, it might also belie contemporary attitudes towards women's unpaid labor and domestic confinement. Certainly with agricultural shifts and the rise of local creameries and the marriage ban, women's waged work opportunities were sorely limited in this period. Anthropologists, in fact, have described unmarried daughters miserably slaving away for their families, treated with disdain and eventually often ousted by whoever married their inheriting brother. The next account, Michael J. Murphy collected from his widowed farmer grandmother, Susan Murphy, who was 96 years old, was a native of the area. And you can see her in this photo. She's the woman who's standing just inside the door of her son's home. I know it's not a great photo, but I just think it's fantastic. Here she's visually, literally, domestically confined. So this is Susan Murphy's tale of St. Brigid. Quote, St. Brigid was followed to Foggart by a man of bad character, and she knelt in the running water and prayed for the eyes to fall from her head. The man was on horseback and lashed her with a whip and her down on her knees in the stream. In contrast to Wood's version, where Brigid was described as a good-looking lassie, in Susan Murphy's tale, Brigid is blameless and incredibly vulnerable when she's terrorized and attacked by a moral-lacking, whip-wielding aggressor. Brigid's desperation, as she prays in the stream, is clear. From this terse, frank telling of the assault of a woman on foot by a man on a horse, one wonders if Brigid was saved from further violence, or if the tale was merely told as if she were. While I have a lot more on St. Brigid, it's time to turn to folklore that relates to asymmetric patriarchal marriage, as well as marital violence. There's a persistent international tradition of gendering vulnerable water creatures who can become intimates as female. The most popular 20th century Irish iteration of the swan maiden motif is the mermaid, followed by the shape-shifting selkie. 20th century Irish folklore is replete with mermaid stories. And so I'm going to give you a couple examples. This example was part of the school's collection. It was contributed by Willie McCree, who was 10 years old at the time, a student of Mary K. Nutt in County Donegal. Quote, there was once upon a time a man who was fishing at the sea. He saw a mermaid and he caught her and brought her home. The under part of her was like a fish's tail, and she had long hair growing down her back. When the man brought her home, he slipped off her tail, and she was then a beautiful young woman. She lived with this young man and became his wife. They had 2 children, and all were very happy together. And the mermaid seemed to have forgotten all about the sea and her life there. This state of affairs continued for 6 years. Dun, dun, dun. Then, one bright summer's morning, the husband went off to a fair, and the children went to school, and the mermaid was left alone in the house. Being all alone, she thought she would give the house a good cleaning. All went well until she commenced to dust the top of the dresser. There, hidden from view by old papers, she found her mermaid's tail. She recognized it and fitted it on, just to see if it would fit her. It fitted perfectly, but alas, with the mermaid's tail on came the desire for the sea and the free, happy life she had there. Forgetting all about her happy home and the little children, she made for the sea as quickly as she could, and she went off to join her friends once more. Towards evening, the husband returned home from the fair and the children returned home from school. They found the mother missing, the fire out, and the spring cleaning unfinished. A search was made, but no trace of the wife could be found. Looking on top of the dresser, the husband discovered that the mermaid's tail was missing. Then he knew what happened. That his wife had found her tail and had gone to the sea. She was never seen anymore, and husband and children were left alone to mourn her loss. I probably should have mentioned in the abstract that what I say next might ruin mermaids for you, so I'm sorry about that. This tale, like so many others, adopts a patriarchal point of view. The mermaid is captured and altered to make her more appealing and useful to her amorous captor, beautiful and helpless. Upon finding a moment to herself after 6 years, the tale imagines that she would want to thoroughly clean her house, as opposed to, say, taking a nap or getting a chance to enjoy a hot cup of tea. Anyway, the family that kept her in captivity notices she's not there, but seem most focused on the obstacles to their comfort that her absence has caused, the cold, messy house, rather than the fact that she's finally enjoying her rightful freedom. Before I go on with my analysis, I want to show you another brief example. This was part of the school's collection, and it comes from County Kerry. Quote, as a man was walking along the strand in Glen Bay, he saw a mermaid sitting on a rock combing her hair. He stole over to where she was, and seeing a little cap near her, he took it. And the mermaid, looking around for her cap, could not find it. By losing this cap, she had also lost her power to return to the sea. The man then brought her home and married her. They lived happily together with the children for a long time, until one day the man was cleaning the loft in which he kept his fishing tackle. He threw down the mermaid's cap. The minute she saw it, she grabbed at it and off with her back to the sea. The husband and children were all very lonely after her. And then I just want to share one more anecdote about captured water creatures to show how seals feature in these tales. Just it's going to help me out with the next thing that I cover here. An excerpt of this anecdote was collected as part of the schools project, which dates from 1937 to 1938. Quote, one time a man named O'Dowd was out near the sea and caught a seal. He took off the thing for swimming, and the seal was a woman. The two got married, and they had 3 in the family. One fair day, when the father was gone, the mother asked the children, did they see anything at their father? One of them seen him putting it in the stack of oats. She went out, tumbled the stack, got the thing for swimming, and then she's off to sea. In addition to providing fantasy female escape from the drudgery of housework and child rearing, these tales can be read as depicting gender roles in male-dominated heterosexual couplings, and to offer a critique of patriarchal marriage. The overwhelming majority of these anecdotes describe amorous predatory men looking to kidnap women for selfish exploitive aims. With the theft of their power, to escape and torn from their friends, the female is made instantly vulnerable and trapped into marrying the man who stole her freedom. Belying the happy life that she enjoyed in captivity, the woman never stops yearning for liberation. And once she finds her variously labeled cap, caul, tail, cloak, or shell, in the different stories, it's different items, which she always does, even the love of her children can't stop her from running to the sea and leaving forever. The bleak lesson for women is that the only escape from oppressive marriage involves permanent alienation from one's children in either exile or death. Okay, it's time to talk about marital violence in post-independence Ireland. As Cara Diver writes, from 1922 to at least 1965, but perhaps until the passage of the Domestic Violence Act and legalization of divorce in 1996, due to women's inferior social, political, and economic position, men were able to beat their wives with impunity. And of course, Ireland is not unique in this. It's a global, or it has been a global issue. Elizabeth Steiner Scott writes of the lack of public outcry regarding marital violence in the post-famine period as due to, quote, a reluctance to expose Ireland's social ills during a time of heightened nationalist activity, unquote. Louise Ryan discovered marital violence was dismissed in the post-independence period as being un-Irish and largely due to foreign influences. Cara Diver continues writing that especially for those of the working class, women had little hope of escaping violent marriages. They had no access to divorce facilities and few legal remedies. Most remained economically dependent on their husbands, and a variety of cultural and religious factors dissuaded them from pursuing marriage separation. By failing to provide abused women with any path of escape or effective form of resistance, Irish culture inadvertently sanctioned marital violence. Indeed, the battered woman in post-independence Ireland faced a terrible predicament. She was on her own and yet remained hopelessly dependent, unquote. Diver's description is startlingly similar to the plight of the captive mermaid, on her own and hopelessly dependent. And I assert that part of the popularity of mermaid anecdotes in 20th century Irish folklore is due to the coincidence of circumstances between the lore and the bleak realities of marriage, of course, minus the watery origin story. Perhaps offering further insight into the popularity of mermaid tales, as well as how they reflected women's choices, Linda Gordon, who studied family violence in the United States, specifically in Boston from 1880 to 1960, suggests that some battered women stayed with their abusive spouses as they feared losing access to the children, while others chose to leave, hoping to protect their children from violence. Keeping all this in mind, I want to move to share some coded allegorical anecdotes about vulnerable water creatures. While these tales can be interpreted in multiple ways, I'm arguing that these communally related narratives likely in part engaged marital violence towards women. Each tale involves a wild yet vulnerable water creature just before or just after it's been attacked by a man with murderous intent in its watery home or close to the aggressor's home. In the tales, mysterious creatures protest their treatment using women's voices. Each tale's jarring as the malevolent barbarity of the man's act comes into focus through the victim's surprising and disruptive speech. It's likely that storytellers resorted to allegory because the aggression was so horrific and beyond acceptable norms for marital violence that it had to be dissociated. Due to broader folklore, not only mermaids and selkies, but calls and other elite and popular cultural references, see in this regard especially Moyna Sullivan, I interpret these creatures' wetness as specifically associating them with female bodies and bodily processes. The first tale that I want to look at was transcribed in 1939 by Brian McMahon, who collected this from an 88-year-old John Carmody of County Kerry. Quote, there was, oops, let's see, oh no, this is not the one, sorry. There was a man by the name of John O'Sullivan living below at Asti at Letter House. He lived by selling seal skins and seal oil. He went one day to Ballybunion Caves to shoot a seal. The seal was going to have young ones, and she called him by his name and said not to shoot her until she would be better. He said he would not, and he would not shoot a seal after if he got any money. From that day until the day he died, he would not shoot a seal anymore. Not only surprising, the use of human speech on the part of a wild creature demonstrated to O'Sullivan that this was not a subhuman foreign other. Her familiarity, expressed by knowing and addressing O'Sullivan by name, revealed a kinship between the two that interrupted O'Sullivan's murderous actions and permanently changed him. It's significant that O'Sullivan entered the seal's domestic enclosure, a place she sought for protection and rest that was clearly anything but a haven when O'Sullivan entered. Further, within the seal's domestic space, she called him by his name, indicating that he was an intimate. The pregnant seal's surprising speech and desperate plea jars the audience and engenders uneasiness, intimating that this tale is probably not just about seals. The fatalism of the pleading seal is notable. Rather than protesting the violence, she merely asked for a stay of her execution until her young ones were delivered. Perhaps the storyteller thought protection should only extend through pregnancy, or perhaps the meekness of the request was meant to demonstrate the extraordinary and deplorable vulnerability of a creature without rights or recourse to other authorities than a man with a gun in her home. It seems that among the goals of this tale was to bring similar aggressors, or at the very least the audience, to their senses. This fatalism could also be a reflection of what Elizabeth Steiner Scott describes as the inevitability of wife beating in the post-famine period because patriarchal marriage was inherently unequal. Further, the storyteller might, as Linda Gordon suggests battered women in Boston did, be using the platform of motherhood to challenge husband's violence. There's a seemingly fantasy element in the anecdote. The idea that a helpless creature can merely call an aggressor by name to be viewed as worthy of life and be protected from assault. It works in the story and might reflect the desire of one who witnessed or experienced trauma to experiment with a happier ending. This next tale was related, comes from County Cork in 1939. While no gender is indicated for the unfortunate seal in the anecdote, the cultural context suggests female identity. Quote, yes, I remember to hear a man named Jammie Call, who lived near Port-au-Blas and in this area, tells such a story. Jammie was a great lobster fisher. There was not a cove or cavern on the Donegal coast, but he knew. He also fished all around the west coast of Scotland. There was a cavern just to the west side of the Horn, known as Lam Alpar, which is a great resort for seals. These seals are often hunted as they do great damage to salmon. Once on a time, Jammie entered this cavern with a gun. He heard some movement in the faraway end of the cavern, so he fired, and immediately a voice in great agony shouted, "Oh, Jammie, what have you done?" Jammie advanced up to the end of the cavern, and there he found a large seal just drawing its last breath, being shot through the head. Jammie declared that it was certainly the seal who spoke. And from that day to the day of his death, he never again fired on a seal. It's curious that Jammie, known as a great lobster fisher, would fire into a cave of seals who did damage to salmon, but not lobster. The detail might be a way to underline Call's recklessness and the gratuitous nature of his aggression toward a seal sheltering with a cavernous home. Perhaps this was a way to show Call's meanness and his refusal to share food or resources, even those unessential to his survival. This tale portrays the heinousness of needlessly murdering a being who knew her aggressor by name. Rather than a random strange creature, it was an intimate whom Call fired upon and killed. Again, the use of the aggressor's name reframes the violence, making it a shocking murder scene rather than a lobster fisher's adventure. The next anecdote refers to eels, and there's some interesting gender switching that happens. Reported in 1938 by folklore correspondent Peter Kilkenny of County Leitrim, Kilkenny wrote the following regarding the master eel, quote, "The monsters that inhabit our lakes and rivers here in Leitrim usually take the form of monster eels. They can travel over land and in many cases have the power of speech. If overtaken on land, they put their tails in their mouths and let out a loud whistle. This whistle calls all eels for miles around. They travel overland and putting the tail in their mouth, thus forming themselves into a ring. The largest eel in the lake is known as the master eel. Oftentimes, these eels come out and make nests out of old decayed grass convenient to the river or lake. Men have often been mowing the sedge and have often grazed the eel's back while he was lying coiled up in the nest. The eel, in such cases, cries in the voice of an old woman, 'Ah, why did you do that to me?' puts its tail in its mouth, lets out a loud whistle, and goes off for the river or lake." Unquote. The unmolested eel was referred to as he, but the voice of the eel used to protest violent treatment was female. In folklore, festive and disruptive demonstrations, like what wedding straw boys or agricultural agitators, white boys and Molly Maguires, also St. Brigid's Day performers, frequently disguised their gender or adopted feminine costumes when protesting poor treatment. This appears to indicate a feminization of vulnerability and of righteous protest. And I think we're seeing some of that here. It appears that Kilkenny's contribution participates in this matrix of cultural lore. In Kilkenny's version, the eel's old woman identity demonstrates the creature's helplessness and right to better treatment. She does not threaten the mowing men, but rather loudly complains of her mistreatment and beats a hasty retreat to her watery home. Now, Kilkenny continues, quote, "I once heard the following story. There was a man one time, and he caught a master eel. He was very big, and when he brought him home, he was still alive. He brought the eel out on the street and got a hatchet to cut off his head. The eel spoke and said, 'Ah, John, sure you won't kill me.' The man let the eel go, and immediately it put its tail in its mouth and let a whistle. In a few moments, hundreds and hundreds of eels came rolling like hoops and got round the master eel and led him back to the lake," unquote. In this tale, the gender identity of the creature switches when the eel speaks, and again when it escapes. This could be due to linguistic male normativity. Perhaps if the creature hadn't spoken, it would be understood in masculine terms. But the act of speech was interpreted and heard as female. A likely reflection of the male domination of the society is that in all these tales, surprising disruptive voices that protest ill treatment are female. In the seal stories, the men learn their lessons and never harmed a seal again. All we know about John, the almost beheader, is that his victim's words caused him to release her. Liberated, she was able to signal for help. Soon surrounded by a horde of similar creatures, she's escorted safely home. Perhaps this was a coded way to indicate women of the community or the woman's family extricating her from a dangerous John. Imaginative resistance to domestic violence against women can be found in 20th century Irish folk narratives. In tales of eels and seals, cornered creatures spoke in female voices to demand recognition of their kinship to male aggressors and to protest poor treatment. The coded communal lore reveals uneasiness regarding the marginalization of women and condemnation of extraordinary marital violence, or it can reveal that. While there was a somewhat fatalistic acceptance of some domestic violence in Irish folk culture, these allegorical tales illustrate that murderous violence was viewed as unacceptable and repulsive. Allegorical tales created the space to relate horrifying violence narratives. They provided a safe way to process traumatic events without incurring social stigma. I argue that these tales allowed a community to reckon with the injustices and encourage would-be abusers to take a different path. In examined allegorical tales, women were initially fully othered as wild, watery creatures. Despite this, in these imaginatively resistant tales, the othered creatures' magical use of human female voices and men's names broke the spell for both the aggressor and for the audience. Their utterances shattered the illusion of women's otherness and engendered horror in men's violence, also encouraging empathy for the victim's vulnerability and lack of recourse. The shocking climax of each terse tale causes the allegory to at least temporarily fall away. These tales, for a moment, are not about seals and eels. They're about men with murderous intent towards females with whom they're intimately connected. At the conclusion of the tales, the articulate watery creatures appear more human and representative of decency and fairness than their male aggressors. While battered women were trapped in dangerous, oppressive marriages, in some imaginative stories, they could flee, find freedom and safety, and in doing so, offer temporary respite and hope to others trapped by traumatic circumstances. Thank you.